So today we will review the urinary system using this kidney board. So the first thing we'll look at is the kidney here. And so first thing you'll see is that you have your ureter here, your renal vein, your renal artery. And this whole area here, this region is called the renal hilus. And as you see here, the kidney has an outer layer here, this brown layer here, which we call the capsule, and you can also see the capsule here as well. So remember, the kidney has the layer underneath the capsule, which we call the renal cortex. So again, that's the layer here. It's the superficial layer that's covered by the capsule, the renal capsule. And then the other deeper layer is all this layer. So this layer here is called the renal medulla. So you have the renal medulla here and the renal cortex here. So within the renal medulla, you have these structures here. So that's what we call the renal pyramids. And the white area between the renal pyramids, this area here, is called the renal column. So as you know, the kidney contains the collecting system, which collects urine. So that's what we call the minor calyx, which is 5. So this would be minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx. So the minor calyx drain into a major calyx. So a major calyx would be here as well as here. And these major calyxes drain into the renal pelvis, which drains out through the ureter, number 3. So as we know, there's blood supplied to the kidney. So this is the renal artery. Blood flows into the segmental artery. And the segmental arteries branch into these arteries here, number 13, which we know of as interlobar arteries. And the interlobar arteries branch into these arteries here, which we call arcuate arteries. And the arcuate arteries branch into these structures here, which we call the cortical radiate arteries. And if you look at the cortical radiate arteries, you have an artery that branches out, right, into these tubes here, these these white circles, sorry, and those are called renal corpuscles. So we're going to zoom in on this structure. So again, you can imagine that this kidney is divided into lobes, right? So the lobe would be like an imaginary line here. So imaginary line going like this, and that's this. Okay, so this is representing a renal lobe. Again, this is the capsule of the renal lobe, this is the cortex of the renal lobe, and this is the medulla of your renal lobe, which also includes your renal pyramid. So again, we talked about this artery coming off the segmental artery, which this one's called the interlobar artery, and then it branches into arcuate arteries. And then arcuate arteries branch into these cortical radiate arteries, which then branches off that are called the afferent arterioles. And the afferent arterioles, as you see here, enter into a glomerulus. That's the red part there. And then once you have the glomerulus, then you have the exiting of blood after filtration happens into an efferent arteriole. So this is afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole. So we can zoom in on this. This is it. So there's your afferent arteriole, number 6. That's your glomerulus, number 8, which is also a fenestrated capillary. And then the blood then flows out that's not filtered by the kidney in this number 7, which is the efferent arteriole. So afferent arteriole, blood then enters the glomerulus, and then the blood that's not filtered out exits the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole, which is number 7. So as you see here, the blood flows out of the efferent arteriole, goes into this structure here, which we call the peritubular capillaries, where you see the red changing to blue. And then those peritubular capillaries drain into venules, then into a cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, and then finally into the renal vein, number 1. So again, as we talked about, these structures here, number 1, these balls are called renal corpuscles. The reason why we call them renal corpuscles is because, as we know there's a glomerulus inside here, because when you cut it, you can see it there, right? So therefore, since we know there's a glomerulus inside of here, then we can't call this white the Bowman's capsule unless we can distinguish and separate the two, which you can see here. So again, after you cut the renal corpuscle, you're able to then distinguish and differentiate between the red, the glomerulus, and the white, the Bowman's capsule. So one would be the Bowman's capsule, red would be the glomerulus. That's what you see here. So red would be glomerulus. This outer layer here would be the Bowman's capsule. But remember, the Bowman capsule is made up of several parts to it. So the part that's covering the glomerulus, right? So covering this, which is the tan, are called the podocytes, or the visceral epithelium of the Bowman's capsule. Then you have the capsular space, which is this area here. And then you have this outer region of the Bowman's capsule, which we call the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule. So remember, this is where filtration happens. So blood leaves the glomerulus, passes the podocytes, enters the capsular space of the Bowman's capsule, and then flows out of this structure here, which we call the proximal convoluted tubule. Right, so the proximal convoluted tubule is represented by this part here, as well as this part, number 2A. And then urine flows then to the next part of the nephron, which we call the nephron loop. So that's that there, and then the urine then flows to the next part here, which is D, which is the distal convoluted tubule, where it then enters number 5, the connecting tubule, and then number 6, the collecting duct. So again, what's the difference from this structure here and this structure here? So the difference is that this one here, both of them, again, are nephrons. This one as well as this one. But this is called the cortical nephron because most of the tubules are found in the cortex of your kidney. While this one here is called the juxtamedullary nephron because the tubules are found nearby the border between the cortex and the medulla. That's what we call it, juxtaglomerular nephron. Right, so remember the juxtaglomerular nephron, which is the one shown here on the right, contains a longer loop of Henle, or nephron loop, than the cortical nephron, right? Much shorter there than here. Right, and as you can see here, here's your proximal convoluted tubule, here's your distal convoluted tubule. As you see here, the distal convoluted tubule is right next to where you have the afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole. So that's what you see here. So here's your afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole, right next to it, distal convoluted tubule. Remember, this is proximal convoluted tubule. So this model is also showing you the juxtaglomerular apparatus. What is that? So it contains technically 3 cells, but here the model only shows 2 of those 3 cells. So these cells here that make up this portion of the distal convoluted tubule are called macula densa cells. Well, these cells here that are part of the afferent arteriole are called juxtaglomerular cells because they're nearby the glomerulus, juxtaglomerular cells. So therefore, the juxtaglomerular cells plus the macula densa cells equals a complex which we call the juxtaglomerular complex or juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right, and so that's the model of your kidney.